you see, everybody now lives in their own personal reality because everybody's interpretation is a little different because their experience base is a little different. So all of us live in different reality frames. When you say, how could those people be so stupid? Well, those people don't see the same reality that you do. It's not that they're stupid. They just see a different reality because they've been fed data that defines that other reality frame. So they're looking at us and saying the same thing. How could they be so stupid? Because they figure that we share their reality, but we don't. Yeah, so everybody lives in their own reality. And the way it works is that it takes, information is non-physical. So consciousness is non-physical. Consciousness is an information system. Books are physical. Ink is physical. And that produces data. Data can be physical. So what happens is that information isn't the ink and it isn't the paper. It's the content. It's the significance. It's the meaning that it finds in all those squiggles of ink on that paper. A consciousness looks at it and those squiggles have meaning. Okay, so the first interpretation is you take the symbols, the data. A consciousness looks at the symbols, data, and turns it into meaning or significance. And that is not a 100% function. That depends a lot on the individual, how they do that. It depends on the language, how precise the language can be, how precise is the writing, or the squiggles on the paper. So there's a lot of imprecision and uncertainty there, and it has to do with the individual. Now, that consciousness who gets that meaning and content, it would like to share that with somebody else. So it takes that information and it codes it into data and it sends it to that somebody else. Now, it may be a sound wave coming out of my mouth, or it may be a clickety click for an old teletype machine, or it could be anything, but that's data. It could be an email, and it's digital marks on digital paper, and whatever it is, and it sends it to somebody in the form of data. Now, the person that gets that, the person it's sent to, the receiver, they see the data, they look at it, and they interpret that data based on their own experience base, which is not necessarily what was meant by the person who encoded it from his personal base.
Which is a beautiful explanation for why communication is so hard.
That's exactly why communications is so hard, and that's exactly why we all live in our own reality, in our own separate reality. Communications is very difficult. So information is the content, the meaning. Remember, we said that in that information system, you had all random bits, no information, but then if you had organization of some symbols or some things that meant something, the information is the meaning that meant something. So then we have dictionaries that give us meaning for all kinds of symbols. If we string symbols together the right way, they have certain meaning. We call those things, strings of symbols, words. And we look at those, and that's the meaning. But it takes a consciousness to get the meaning, to get the content. You see, that's the thing of consciousness. That's non-physical. How much space does meaning take? How much sense does significance take? Well, it doesn't take up any space, doesn't have any weight. It's non-physical. So that's the difference between data and information. Consciousness creates information. So now you've got a larger consciousness system who has a subset of its part that's acting as a server, a computer, serving us a data stream. We take in that data stream, we bias it with our own biases and with our data stream. We come up with some kind of an idea, and that interpretation we make of it is what we see as reality.
You're also referring to, if I get you right, what's called qualia sometimes. The mysterious quality of qualia. Why does something feel like? Why does a rose smell like? And all these internal sensations that we perceive as human beings, which we don't really have a good explanation for. You seem to allude to that.
Yes, these are our interpretations of data, and people can interpret it quite differently. Yeah. So we can't specify it physically because it isn't physical. That's why people say, well, what are these qualia? And you just can't get a handle on them. That's because they're non-physical. They're not physical things. They're interpretations of the data by an individual. Now, this takes us back to the double slit, because why is it that in a double slit experiment, the observer makes such a big difference? See, the observer who now has observed it, went through the slit, collapses that wave function to just piles of particles behind each slit. Why is that? That's because until a player gets the data, it's not in this reality. It only becomes a part of this virtual reality as it gets to the mind of a player.
Because that is the idea of the simulation. Yeah. It only renders content whenever a player needs to have that content.
Exactly. So because of that, that's what makes the double slit experiment work the way it works. So that, for them to look at it and say, oh, I know it went through here. Now there's information coming to a player. And when you get that information, then there's a result. When you have that information, you have to get piles of particles behind each slit. And you don't have that information, then it's not in that reality yet until it hits the screen. It's still just probability until it hits the screen. And when it hits the screen, it's a random draw from that probability distribution.
I get that part, but strictly speaking, following your logic so far, if I followed you correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, there should be different outcomes for different observers and not the same. I mean, so far in quantum mechanics, several observers had similar outcomes as long as the experiment design was similar. But according to what you're saying, the outcome should never be predictable, depending on who's doing the experiment and who's more importantly, who's watching what's been recorded.
Yeah. No, it's only when you get into details that are personal that you're going to get a personal result. But if you're just a detail of is something there or not, is there a microphone in front of you? Well, me and everybody else who's seeing this video, we don't have to say, well, okay, it's my opinion that, I think there might be, or I don't think that thing's a microphone. It looks like maybe a can with a, with a little black pom-pom on top. That's not a microphone. So everybody looks at that and says it's there because that's not personal. But if you said, is that a good microphone? Is that a good quality microphone? Now you'd have all sorts of different opinions about whether or not that was a good quality microphone or not.
So there's a subset of information overlapping, which we, have a consensus on as to our shared reality, which applies to everyone. Like people walk, on 2 feet and have 2 arms and yada yada. All these things that make up our human existence. We have a consensus on that because that is the shared subset of information to the players. I mean, it's a part of the rule set that is common for all these avatars of similar make, if I may say it that way. Yes, exactly. So that is a shared reality, and there is personal reality deviating or splitting off from that, which is deeply personal and can only be personal because it's only relevant to that avatar / player inside the virtual reality system.
Yeah. So it's all a matter of uncertainty. So those things that we interact with that have very small natural uncertainty associated with them, they seem to be objective, like that mic in front of you or the wall behind you.
Or materialism for so long.
They seem to be objective because they have very small uncertainty. Now they have a little bit of uncertainty, but it's real tiny. So the things that have a lot of uncertainty, like how good a mic is that? You see, well, it depends on how much you know about mics and if you're familiar with that brand that's written there on the side that I can see, and and how many models of that. So there's a lot of variables there, and there's uncertainty about those. And because of that, people will have a lot of different opinions. But because there's very little uncertainty as whether or not there's something that looks like a mic in front of you, there's very little uncertainty about that. So then everybody agrees on that. So we agree on things, and we see things as being objective if their associated uncertainty is small. Actually, everything is subjective, which is what you're saying. It's what, everything is subjective. But there's a whole set of things that are approximately objective because their uncertainty is small. The things that have large uncertainty are subjective, what we call subjective, but everything's actually subjective.
So apparently we want to hang on to the concept that if our experience here is meaningful, if our personal consciousness or we as individuated units of consciousness are supposed to be significant, then we like to think as, we cling to this idea that something of us should last, indefinitely, ideally. What do you make of that within your theory?
You are an individuated unit of consciousness. You're not your avatar. So your avatar, just like your elf, dies. And that doesn't mean that you, the consciousness, doesn't die because your elf dies. The boy playing that elf doesn't fall over, on his desk, with his face, on the mouse because his elf died. They're two different things. So we are the consciousness. We're the player. And when our body dies, we, consciousness, go on. We're immortal. We just keep going on. And what do we do next?
We lose one avatar, we might get another.
We get another. We get another one. And the point is, we're here to make choices to grow up, to reduce the entropy of our consciousness, to evolve the quality of our consciousness. And we can't do that very quickly because it requires changing ourselves, who we are, growing up and becoming love, that caring, that kindness, that about other that we need to emulate, which is the reason that we're here in this virtual reality entropy reduction trainer. That's the point. That's why we're here, and we have to try it again and try it again and try it again because this growth is a very slow process.
Which supports the idea of reincarnation. We might get another shot as a human being.
Right.
And so we're helping the larger consciousness system playing the game of evolution so long as it wants to. What happens when entropy is zero? It lowered all the entropy there was. What happens then?
Never gets there. Just like you can, in the physical world, you can never get to absolute zero, just because the act of trying to cool it heats it. You can never actually get there. And that's the same with entropy. You cannot get to a zero entropy. And entropy, to be lowered, always requires the input of work. You have to do things. You just don't sit around and your entropy drifts lower. If you just sit around, your entropy drifts higher. Entropy increases. That's the second law of thermodynamics. If you don't put some sort of energy in, then your entropy is going to get greater, not smaller. So you're trying to lower your entropy. It takes work. So even if you could get to zero, which you can't, if you got there and said, I'm at zero, okay, I'm done. As soon as you say I'm done, your entropy starts going up because you're no longer putting energy into keeping it low. So that's a reason why you are never done and you never get to zero, because it always takes effort to lower entropy. Consciousness, of course, is an information system. It's trying to evolve, which means it's trying to lower its entropy. So it's looking for ways to do that. It needs, it has a certain number of possibilities of new states it could move into. It could maybe make more intricate patterns of sequences of patterns and say, that lowers entropy some because I'll give those special meaning. But eventually it starts to level out, it goes asymptotic. The growth, the lowering of entropy kind of runs out of options. You've kind of made as many patterns that make any sense. And you kind of hit that wall and you're getting diminishing returns for the effort put in, right? So what you need then is something new, a new idea, a new dimension in which you can move. And that new dimension that opens up more possibilities, well, it's the same dimension that single-celled things took here in our biology, right? You had a single-celled thing, and it evolved into a multi-celled thing, which evolved into a thing with specialization of those multi-cells,